Welcome to Kuyperian Commentary. This is episode 93. I am your host, Yuri Brito. Our own day is plagued by individualism. Now, there is, of course, a natural sphere for the individual, but at times this sphere, like the others, quickly is endangered by the abuses of it. As we face unprecedented attacks on our liberties in this country, liberties which, by the way, are being taken away systematically in other countries like Australia, for example. The Christian needs to have a proper understanding of the role of the individual, not only in relationship with the other spheres of the church, the state, and the family, but also in relation to the question of the Christian conscience in response to particular mandates, whether they come from LGBTQ communities or governmental mandates concerning vaccines, or whatever. This is just a very important question to have in our day and very pertinent to our current societal concerns. We're happy to have this conversation with Pastor Bill Smith, who's here with us. He's the senior pastor of Cornerstone Reformed Church in Carbondale, Illinois, and he published an article recently at Kuyperian Commentary entitled Liberty of Conscience. And we're very glad to welcome him to the podcast. Welcome, Bill.
It's good to be here, Yuri.
Delight to have you, my brother. Your article was very helpful in terms of laying out just a general outline of this conversation on the liberty of conscience, which is a conversation that Christians have had for a long time, but it seems to have been hidden for quite some time. And now it's at the forefront of a lot of modern conversations, especially those of us in the Reformed tradition. When you look at the Reformational history, Bill, you mentioned one particular example, which is the example of Luther and the Diet of Worms in 1521. Summarize that illustration for us, that historical example for us, and then give us a little bit of an introduction to the liberty of conscience and the doctrine of the Christian conscience means.
Sure. Luther had recently been excommunicated just a few months before that diet convened, and they asked him to recant his teachings. And of course, that's where his famous lines came in about his conscience. His conscience is captive to the word of God, and to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. And so that's where he said, "Here I stand, I can do no other. God help me." And so he one of the things that he recognized is that his conscience was bound, just basically what's reflected in the Westminster Confession of Faith in chapter 20 is that God alone is the Lord of the conscience, and his conscience has to be bound by an ultimate authority. And because popes and councils have erred, they cannot bind the conscience. This is rooted, of course, in the principle that there is no earthly absolute authority, and that these authorities are always held in check. They're always under God. They're always under the absolute authority of God. And that includes, by the way, the individual's conscience. His is not an absolute authority. And that's where we get the individualism that has arisen as the Christian faith was somewhat mixed up with, if you want to say, with Enlightenment rationalism and everything that came out of Rousseau and all those, the French Revolution and all the things like that. And we got tied up with the Enlightenment, and there was a mixture of the two, a syncretism of some sort, and that's just to be understood. Liberty of conscience, and as it is understood biblically, did get muddled some, and became almost the absolute sovereignty of the individual to do whatever he wanted. However, and that's where we get all of our individualism today, is that I can do whatever I want. Nobody can tell me anything. But historically, the Reformation said no, and it's outlined in the Westminster Confession of Faith in chapter 20, as I said, is that no, we cannot use the liberty of conscience to defy the authorities, the rightful authority that God has placed over us in ecclesiastical or civil realms, or even in the familial realm. But those authorities are there to keep one another in check. That there is this constant tension between these authorities, which is a necessary thing to keep everybody honest, so to speak. So I have authority in my home. I have authority over my wife because I am, according to the scriptures, I'm the head of my wife as Christ is the head of the church, and as Christ is the head of the church, he's the authority of the church. And so I have that authority, but my authority is not absolute. I can't tell my wife to go and do something that is sinful. If I do that, then she is bound by God's word to disobey me. It becomes her duty then to disobey the authority. She's not going out on her own. She has a conscience before God. She's going to answer to God. She's going to give an account to God for how she obeyed him. And Paul lays that out in Romans 14:12. He said, so then each one of us will give an account to God. And so it's rooted in that. The liberty of conscience and conscience itself is rooted in that, is that each one of us has a responsibility. We have the privilege of this liberty, but we have a responsibility before God. We're going to give an answer to God for the authority that he's given to us as individuals and how we use that authority to serve him within all these different realms. But then how we obeyed him or did not obey him when, for instance, Caesar tells us to do something that we ought not do. Did we obey him or did we obey Caesar? So that was just a little ramble there, but hopefully understandable.
No, that's very helpful. That's very helpful and very thorough as well. You mentioned something interesting that came out in your article about this necessary tension when you put all these spheres together. And Kuyper talks a lot about this, of course, right. But there is a necessary tension. And I think what churches and institutions have sort of experienced in these last 2 years have been the tensions of sphere conflict coming to the forefront of these modern discussions. And so as a pastor, when you look at the natural tensions between, the individual and the family, individual and the state, individual and the church, what's the path forward, Bill? What's the path forward to the tensions will exist? That's a natural outworking of any difficult conversation, right?
Right.
What's the path forward? Where is there a necessity? Because I see all these under the authority of the fifth commandment, for example. I think it plays a significant role there. How do we move forward so that society doesn't enter into this dysfunctional era where nothing works? Or are you saying to me that we have already entered that era?
Well, let me address one thing first. Two things. First of all, the idea that if we obey everything, then everything will work out fine. If we just have a tyranny, then everything's going to work out fine. One of the problems with tyranny, among many, well, you can look at the historical examples of tyranny and see that it's never worked out, but there are reasons why it doesn't work. The sinfulness of man, pervades those tyrannical, despotic governments. But we are created as individuals to grow, to mature, to make decisions on our own, to move from priest to king to prophet. And one of the things that tyranny does in some sense, and I would say this broadly, is to keep us in a priestly stage, if you would. All the rules, don't make decisions for yourself. And society, individuals cannot grow under tyranny. We cannot mature, therefore we cannot fulfill the mandate that God's given to us when there's an absolute control over us. Liberty for the individual is necessary, and that's one of the things that, fortunately, in our country, being somewhat grandchildren of the Reformation and our Constitution, even though again it was mixed up with the Enlightenment, we are still in many ways grandchildren of the Reformation, and those principles, biblical principles, came over, grounded in our Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and in the Bill of Rights, that assuming that we are indeed responsible before God for our own, we have unalienable rights to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all those things. And so that's one of the reasons why we flourished as a nation, is that because we had those individual liberties, and because we are able then to make decisions and grow as individuals, as families, with that type of freedom. You cannot mature under tyranny. Tyranny is for children. Give them all the rules, control their environment. But as they grow older, they need to have more freedom so that they can learn to make decisions. But as we grow, then, and you can experience this in the home, you can experience this in a society, you can experience this in a church. As they grow, there's a natural tension that grows. I know that your children are growing older. My children, I have some out of the house. I'm just about to move them all out. But as they grow, as they move into young adulthood, there is this tension that grows, even between parents and children, that they want their independence. They want to make decisions for themselves, yet they're still in my household. And so they have to, there has to be a recognition on the parents' part that, hey, they need to grow up. They need to be making decisions on their own. However, they're still in my household, so there's still some parameters that they have to obey. So one of the things that has to be, there has to be this mutual understanding and humility between the two, this mutual submission that's still a check and a balance. Even though there's tension, there's still this check and balance that says, I think you're overstepping here. I think you need to allow me more freedom, or grasp for more freedom than you need at this particular time. And the key, I think, in those tensions is that humility. And I don't know if we have that in this country. And it's required in the church. Paul says that, and one of the reasons why there is tension in the church in Philippi is that there is a lack of humility. And that's why he calls the church to have the mind of Christ, who was indeed humble and looked to other people's needs above one's personal comforts. And so we don't use our liberty as a cloak of maliciousness. We don't use our liberty as a way to just get what we want without regard for anybody else. And so there has to be that humility that says, I'm willing to listen to you. And if this is really good for everybody else, and if my participation in that is good for everybody, then I will certainly do that. But but you also have to listen to me. I have, for instance, let's just take the recent vaccine issue. I have responsibilities. I have responsibilities to provide for my wife and my children at this particular time in my life. I do all the research. I look at everything that I can with all the information that's available to me. And if I come to the decision to say, you know what, and even if I talk with my doctor and he says, I don't think it's a good idea for you to get the vaccine. You have some things going on in your body that I think the vaccine might cause a reaction, and it would be bad for you. And if that will, and I have the government telling me it's good for society, or I have my job telling me it's good for the business if you get the vaccine. And I say, well, you know what, if I get this vaccine, I'm not going to be able to fulfill my responsibilities over here. And then you're just going to say, oops, I guess we messed up. So and then my family's not cared for. I've put them off on somebody else. And it's because I've neglected and I've just kind of capitulated to authority in a way that I ought not. And I have that responsibility before God. And so I have to think, and I have to take all those things into account. And that's one of the things I think is problematic with all these types of just blanket mandates. Whether you do it in the church or whether you do it in government, is not treating people as individuals. It is kind of this classic tension of the one and the many, and all of us moving to one side or the other. Either we're completely individualistic, or we get into this commune type idea that everybody has to do the same thing. And instead of seeing in good Van Tillian fashion the equal ultimacy of the two, we don't take the individual into account. And I think classically in America, we've been able to do that by having exemptions like this, or by having exemptions from these things, to say, we want to take your needs into account. We realize that there are certain things that you need to do, whether medically or religiously, and they're not going to really harm anybody else. You're just going to be doing these things on your own. That's fine. You're not a threat to society. And so we can't allow this while we're going to require this. Or, if you do this, if you do this over here, then there will be consequences. And anytime I obey my conscience, I have to accept the consequences of what that means. The apostles, I ought to obey God rather than men. Well, okay, we'll crucify you. Okay, well then that's the consequence. But you can't control those consequences always. But in a non adversarial tension, like for instance I have with my children, it's not adversarial. It's a friendly tension. It is, just humbly recognizing their needs while they humbly recognize my authority, is what is needed in all of our relationships. And when you lose that humility, the tension ratchets up to
increases, right,
and it goes into hostility.
Right. No, and I think we've seen that all over the country. I met with a pastor recently who said that half of the pastors in his presbytery had resigned during the COVID season. The tension exists, from the sort of the top down. Yeah, it's pretty significant. I think that's probably where things sort of went off. Bill, you mentioned a lot of several interesting things. One of the patterns I think was helpful in what you said was that the doctrine of the Christian conscience, like other doctrines, is an art, so to speak, which means you have to grow into it. And what Van Til talked about, the epistemic humility, however he phrased it, that kind of humility is necessary so that you don't feel the need to overthrow other spheres. If you were to put the history of the church, the history of civilization, on a piece of paper, what you would see essentially is one sphere with the need to supervise every other sphere under their authority. And that's problematic. I've often said to various folks in these last few months that the pastor's role these days seems to be one of irritating the zealots and not allowing the zealots to control conversations regarding any major issue, whether it be the LGBT community or the conversation about vaccination. So if, you have these two extremes, the one side that says everybody should be vaccinated, nobody should be vaccinated. And the pastor's role is to say, no, you are both irritants to the healthy ministry of the church.
Right.
Stay away, and we'll keep you outside of this conversation. And we will restore a healthy view of Christian conscience so that things don't go astray so quickly. You want to say something about that?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things. I think that's one of the principles that needs to be realized in the liberty of conscience, is that not only should I expect to some degree or another other Christians, especially within the church, to allow me liberty of conscience, but also that needs to be reciprocal. Is that I need to recognize their liberty of conscience as well, and
it's a great point.
I need to respect that, because and Paul deals with that in Romans 14, in the beginning of Romans 15,
right.
all these issues within the church. Now, again, it gets a little trickier, sort of when you move outside the church into the realm of the society. We have, like I mentioned, we have a unique government, pretty much, in recent history, that has recognized that principle that Paul expounded for the church, and how the church is supposed to be an example for the society. if you want to live like, if you want to live right, the church is the model. Okay, this is kind of, you know, everything flows from the table, everything flows from the font, the table, and the pulpit, and the life of the church is supposed to be a model, just like in old covenant Israel, with the law and the nations looking at them saying, hey, that's how you're supposed to live. And the church is supposed to be like that. And so one of the principle of that liberty of conscience that we did recognize does permeate our society and our culture. We're seem to be losing it, unfortunately, because we're losing our liberties, as you mentioned at the beginning of the program. And as I was talking to somebody today, and praying with him, is that because liberty of conscience is a fruit of the gospel, we're losing it because we're losing the gospel in our country. And I'm not talking about there are no churches preaching the gospel. I'm talking about in our institutions. There's not just somebody told me the other day that, and I like this analogy, we're trust fund babies. And we are living off of a trust fund from 200-300 years ago, and the trust fund seems to be running out. And now our institutions are not just okay. We accept some of the principles of the gospel; they're becoming anti-gospel, and as that movement continues, then the liberties that come with the gospel will go with it. And so liberty of conscience is part of that. It's a fruit of the gospel. And that's why, even though I don't want to be hysterical about everything that comes down the pipe, you do want to be like sons of Issachar and understand the times. Understand, wait a minute, what does this look like when they start doing this or when they start doing this? And it becomes a place where we just, if we keep delaying and say, well, we can't use that here, we can't use that here, pretty soon we're going to say, well, now we can't use it at all. It's gone. And so the gospel is the gospel has given us this culture that we've enjoyed for 250 years constitutionally, and in past that, even before, earlier than that, with the Pilgrims and everybody else coming here. And I think we need to do as much as we can to protect that, and fight for that, not only for ourselves, but for our children, for the next generation that's coming, for our brothers and sisters who might be losing jobs, the means to employ themselves. As medical workers are walking out in high percentage because of the forced, vaccinations and things like that. They're losing their livelihoods. They're choosing to do so because of that, and that's part of that. But wanting to provide as much for them and wanting to see the fruits of the gospel in their lives and good for, and everything being good for them. I think we as a church need to be fighting for that, and pastors need to be fighting for that, and need to be fighting for the right, as you mentioned, for vaxxers to get vaxxed, for anti-vaxxers to refuse it. That's their decision. God's given me a stewardship of my body, and if I want to eat broccoli Monday, Wednesday, and Friday because I think that's what's healthy for me, then God bless. But if I don't, I'm going to have to give an account to God for it. But He's given me stewardship of this body, and I need to be, as long as I don't use it as a weapon against somebody else, then and trying to destroy them and disobey them in lawful commands, then I need to have limited sovereignty over what I do.
Mm-hmm. I think about this conversation, and you mentioned something very pertinent when you mentioned about the loss of gospel influence. It seems like as the gospel becomes less and less pervasive, the the willingness in which people give up their conscience or their liberty of conscience becomes even more pervasive.
Yeah.
So that you set the stage for the flourishing of any kind of tyrannical government when the gospel becomes less pervasive, because it softens people's convictions. Right. And it allows people to simply say, okay, whatever you say, and let's go with it. I had one additional thought here as you were speaking, Bill, that the convictions we have at this stage here, as we exercise them under godly leadership and the spirit of humility, everything that you've mentioned, these are gifts from God. Peter Lightheart wrote an article this morning, I think, it's a very brief one for the Theophilus Institute called Diagnosing Our COVID Response. And he brought something to my attention that I thought was interesting, is that I'm reading a little bit into it, but the way we exercise our liberty of conscience, our conscience before God, is in some ways a kind of a preparatory test for whatever is ahead for the church. Yeah. And so if we use our liberty of conscience to deal with abuses, however great or small they are now, that decision is going to prepare us for what is ahead. And right. You mentioned that I think over the years, Christians have become relatively neutral on these matters, thinking that they don't have to give an answer. But I am actually incredibly grateful to God that these issues are now at the forefront of a lot of men in a lot of churches. Because whereas in the past they thought, oh, well, we'll just remain neutral. Now it seems like the matter of Christian conscience has become at the forefront of our minds, and therefore we need to exercise it in a very objective manner. There is no more gray area. Right. It is. Anyway, any thoughts there?
Well, yeah, and I think the individualism, one of the reasons, and I mentioned in the article, sphere sovereignty. Most of the time in our reform circles, we are emphasizing, government and church and family as these spheres, and we're seeing communities. And one of the reasons I think for that is that, we've probably thought the individual's been emphasized enough. And so there was this corrective to say, no, you've got all these other communities to whom you're accountable. And now there has to be something of a recovery of that. Wait a minute. Okay, we didn't mean leave the individual behind. We just needs to be put in a proper place. He needs to understand his context within these things, within these spheres, and that he is a sphere, but he's not ultimate, that he's not absolute, and none of these spheres is absolute. I think it's interesting what you mentioned too, and getting into some of what I'm going to be teaching this Sunday, but you mentioned the fact that losing the gospel, gives us this or preps us for our liberties, giving up our liberties. And one of the reasons that is we are, without the gospel, fear begins to take hold of us. And fear of death, especially, now you've got it all around you with COVID, and everybody's threatening you with death. And of course, that Hebrews 2 speaks about that, who are all their lifetime subject to fear of death. And and the government steps in. You're talking about spheres. The government steps in and says, we can provide safety for you. And when you lose the gospel, the individual doesn't have anywhere to go to feel safe. And safety is one of those things that God does promise us, that God says, even through death, I'm going to keep you safe. So you don't have to fear. You don't have to fear death, even though you need to take care of yourself, even though you need to do everything you can to sustain your health and all those things. You don't need to fear death, because it's just you're going to be raised from the dead. But for those folks who lose the gospel and lose the hope of the gospel, fear of death grips them, and they become ripe for tyranny. They become ripe for just government overreach to say, we can protect you from everything. And with that, you lose, again, that liberty of the individual to say, you know what, I don't have to, I don't have to look to you for that. God's got me. on that.
Right. Pastor Bill Smith is the pastor of Cornerstone Reformed Church in Carbondale, Illinois, and his article, which will be in our notes, is entitled The Liberty of Conscience, published at Kuyperian Commentary a couple of days ago. I really, really encourage you to take a peek at kuyperian.com. Bill, thanks so much for joining us, my brother.
My pleasure.